Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today, the title of which is Work is Changing, How Will It Impact Childcare? My name is Linda Smith, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm the Director of the Early Childhood Initiative at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C. BPC is a Washington, D.C. based think tank that tries to take the best ideas from both sides of the aisle to propose solutions that work for the nation's most pressing problems. And I would tell you that there's probably not many problems more pressing than the issue of getting our country back to work and the need for childcare to support that work. So I think what we're going to try to do is look at what is happening. Work is changing in this country, and I think there's two questions that are important to everyone: is how will this impact parents? How will this impact businesses? And finally, how can childcare be prepared to respond to these changes? So what we're going to do today is look at, next slide, please. If we can look at, there you go, the goals of the most recent survey that we have done. What we were trying to do with this survey is to understand parents' current and preferred work arrangements, their use of childcare beyond the traditional 8 to 6 workday, and the impact that might have on some of these issues around what do we do next with childcare. Look a little bit more deeply at parent or childcare preferences for working families, especially when they rely on parent-provided childcare arrangements. And then obviously understanding some of the impact of all of what's gone on in the last year on children's social emotional development. And we've been trying to take a look at this with the last two surveys. So if we can go to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about, this is the fifth now in a series of surveys that we've done in conjunction with Morning Consult to look at childcare in this country. When we first started doing this work, as some of you on this webinar remember, we were beginning our work on mapping the gap for childcare in the United States. And we started by asking the very simple question: do parents want childcare closer to work or closer to home? We had these conversations. We thought we knew, but we really didn't have any data that told us exactly what they preferred. Well, we got an answer to that, and it was roughly 2 to 1. They prefer it closer to home. Well, now the question is, with work changing in this country, what is their preference going to be going forward? Is it going to change? Will that number closer to home go up? So anyway, a lot of questions to answer. So this survey came out of a lot of those questions. And just so everyone knows, before we get started with the results of the survey, I want to make sure that everyone sees on the screen the survey, the top lines, all of the information. So if you want to dig deeper into anything that you hear on this webinar today, you can go to our website. It's shown on the slide here, and look at the data yourself. We make all of it available to the public. So take a look for anything that you would like to understand more about. And I say that because we're going to work rather quickly through these slides, so we have the most amount of time we can to have a conversation with several people that you will meet here in a few minutes. So looking at the next slide on the survey methodology, just to be sure, the survey was conducted between May 20th and 31st of this last month among a sample of 800 parents of children under the age of 5, with all available parents employed. And I think that's one of the things. We've gone back and forth on some of our surveys between all parents and all employed parents, et cetera. So just know that on this one, this is all parents employed. Has a margin of error rate you see there, and then the respondents are simply referred to as parents just for ease of everything. So let's go to the next slide, please. So what has happened with parents' work arrangements? We know, no surprise there, that COVID changed everything in this country, and especially for parents and parents with young children. So as we rebuild childcare and we move forward, we wanted to understand what the changes in their work and then subsequently their preferences meant. So looking at this is the first time we tried to do this. If we're going to get any kind of understanding of what parents' preferences are, we had to understand their work categories. So we worked with Morning Consult and we came up with the 5 job categories that you see on the screen. And then we wanted to take a look at these categories to understand those who could and could not work remotely, work a hybrid model, or those who absolutely had to be in their whatever work setting was. So these were the 5 job categories. We can have a conversation. Somebody might disagree with some of them, but we found them to be very helpful in understanding what was going on. So if we can go to the next slide, please. When it came to parents' work arrangements, we wanted to, look at how many of the parents that we surveyed said their employer would allow them to work remotely. And so you see the results here on the screen. 58% said their employers would allow them to work remotely. Of those, 81% are doing some type of remote work, whether it's full or a hybrid model, which is a fairly substantial number of young parents in this country. The other thing that we wanted to look at was, okay, how did this differ by different categories, such as parents under 50,000, which it shows there, who work hourly, live in rural areas, and basically are in some type of trade job, are less likely to work remotely. Again, not a complete surprise there. But parents with higher incomes, urban, salaried, and administrative jobs are more likely to be able to work remote. And I think, it isn't necessarily a surprise, but it is data that we needed to know and have some certainty about what was going on out there. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So what were parents' work arrangements? And then we asked the parents also what they preferred. And so if you look at this one, over 60% of all parents prefer some kind of remote work option, whereas 37, and I was trying to get my head around that, 37% of parents who prefer going on site and wondering if they're just tired of being at home. But, we can have that conversation later. One thing that we found, though, is that parents generally prefer their current work situation. So I think that's going to be some indication of how we move forward as we move back into the work situation. And 72% of those parents said they were currently working full-time remote and wanted to keep it that way. So it's going to be some interesting things come out as we begin to emerge from this. Next slide. So if we can look at the parents' work arrangements and their work schedules, and this is one where I think we need to have some serious conversations with our business community, because looking at the number of parents who do not know their work schedule more than 2 weeks in advance is a real challenge for parents when they're trying to arrange childcare, because what childcare program can really redo its schedule with 2 weeks notice? So that's just presents a real challenge for both parents and for the childcare programs who are trying to serve these people. So where on this slide, you see that 29% of parents report they are made aware of their work schedule no more than 2 weeks in advance. And I think that is a serious consideration, again, for businesses. So what does that mean? If you look on the right-hand side of this slide, this looks at the data by race, income, education. And then we looked at it a couple of other ways, too, and looking at who are less likely to know their work assignments: service workers, 49%, and skilled trade workers, 40%. So these different areas really present challenges for our families and our childcare programs. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so their work arrangements right now. The majority, 57%, say that childcare responsibilities have impacted their ability to work over the last month. And I think we're trying to get at exactly what that means. If you look at it, 3/4 of those parents who say childcare impacted their work have missed over 8 hours in the last month of work because of that. So I think as we begin again to work with employers and in our business community, we need to really figure out the impact some of this is having on their ability to get the job done in this country. So if we go to the next slide, please. Now we're going to take a look at their current and preferred actual childcare arrangements. And if we go to the next slide. Okay, so what we were trying to do, as I said earlier, is look at the need for non-traditional hours of care. And, for a long time, we've sort of lumped all that into one particular, just everything other than the 8 to 6 time period. So for this survey, you'll see more of the data if you go online and look at some of the charts that Morning Consult has. But we looked at it by blocks of time. So if you look at certain things, what's going on there, and we're going to show that here in a second. So what is going on right now is that parents are relying heavily on relatives, and that's not a surprise. We've seen this repeatedly over time. Lesser on childcare centers and family childcare homes, parent and partner. That means their shift work, they're balancing shifts and so forth. So still a heavy reliance on the relatives as a way of caring for kids during traditional hours. Now let's go to the non-traditional. Outside of the traditional hours, and what parents need. And this is pretty interesting that 29% report needing it outside of the traditional hours. That is a lot of parents. So close to 30% of parents say they need it during some times other than the 8 to 6 daytime period. So what does this mean for childcare? Has very consequential implications in terms of how do we structure a child care program coming out of COVID that is possibly more responsive to some of the hours of care that are needed by our families. And then what would their preferences be if that were to change? And we did ask some questions here on what parents would prefer if it was completely free, and you'll see those results in a minute. I want to put one other thing on the radar screen here, and that is that if you look at this non-relative friend and neighbor category, I keep saying this every time I can. There's a perception in the country that we have a lot of children in what we call FFN, family, friend, and neighbor care. Most of these children are actually in family or relative care and not friend and neighbor. If you look at the numbers down there, non-relative friend and neighbor care is only 4%. And that's been pretty consistent over all of our survey work since we started doing this. So I think we need to break this myth in childcare that there's a lot of this FFN care out there and start calling it what it is, and then trying to understand why parents are using either themselves or relatives. So go to the next slide, and this is what I was talking about earlier in terms of looking at the hour blocks of time where parents need care outside of this 8 to 6 typical day. And look at the numbers of parents who report they need care between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. in the evenings. It's clearly almost half. And I thought that was really stunning to me that, and as a grandmother who had to rush to pick up grandchildren in the DC area through traffic, the 6 o'clock time period is pretty tough, guys. So I think we need to be thinking about the scheduling of childcare. We will have a conversation, I think, about that as we get into the discussion, but I would also offer that it is more expensive, not cheaper. And I think that we need to have that conversation. But again, 49, nearly half of the respondents saying they needed it between 6 and 8 in the evening. So moving on to the next slide. What we wanted to do also in this was to look at the social and emotional health of children, because as we all know, families have been under stress, children are under stress, and now they're going back into childcare programs, which are having to prepare for children who have been and had some type of negative situation going on over the last year or so, or stress, I should say. So we looked at this. Go to the next slide, please. And we wanted to ask parents what they thought had happened with their children. And 2/3 of parents report that their children's overall development has negatively changed over the last month. And I think that is a very telling number and something that the early childhood community needs to get its head around when it comes to preparing our staff to take care of these children when they do return to childcare over the next, year or so. This survey shows essentially what types of behaviors or changes they were seeing, from eating habits, but all the way down to communication skills, talking, etc. I wanted to point out one thing on this one that's not on the slide, but it's important for people to know that urban parents were much more likely to say that this was an issue for them than rural and suburban parents. And there's something to be thought about when we move forward with that. So if you can go to the next slide. We've been doing a lot of work on the suspension issue and the social emotional health of children, and that's caused us to ask the questions here in this survey. And clearly 8% of parents say their child has been suspended or expelled from childcare because of behavior or disciplinary issues. And again, I think that's something that we all need to be thinking about as we move forward and children come back into the program, given the number of parents who, on the previous slide, reported changes in their children's behavior. So we know that this is going to be something the community is going to have to deal with. Again, the same thing here, where parents in urban communities are more likely to report this has happened to them than in other. And if you look at the regions where this is happening, the West, interesting there. Not real sure what is causing that, but something to be thinking about. If we can move on to the next one. We asked the question because we did as some of you may have participated in a webinar we did on the social, emotional, and mental health consultation model a while back. We were interested in what was going on. And clearly 76%, 3/4 of parents say they would be interested in social, emotional health consultation if it were offered in their childcare settings. And I think that's something that we, again, need to take seriously. A look down on this chart again, where they are very interested. It tracks right with the other pieces where they're saying they have issues and where their children are being expelled. The urban community is the most likely to say they would use this support. Okay, if we can go to the next one. The next couple of slides are going to be really about things that we've been tracking since we started doing this work. The first one, if you can go to the next slide, is about childcare affordability. We've been trying to understand what parents think they can afford, not what some of the data says they can afford. So we've asked this question now. This is the second time we've asked this. And as it turns out, about half, close to half, are saying they can afford less than $200 a week for childcare. I think this is a pretty interesting statistic, one I've been puzzling over as I've looked at the data, in that if you look at what the average cost of care is in the United States across the board, roughly equates to this number of essentially $200 a week. So is the market is that the reason for the fees are pretty consistent with what parents can afford to pay? I think there's some things to be thought through when we look at those numbers. In this one, though, this was particularly interesting because 67% of service and retail workers were reported that they could not afford anything more than that. So again, the service, retail, those people who have less control over their schedules, lower, hourly workers, etc. These things are adding up to me, in my mind. And Claire, when we get into this, you can probably respond to this, to paint a picture of where we have not to spend some time thinking, and that's in certain categories of jobs, certain categories of time where families need things, and so forth. The next question that we asked had to do with the affordability issue, and many of you on this webinar know that our efforts, we are clearly behind extending the child independent care tax credit provisions that have been passed as helping families. We've done a lot of work on looking at the impact that has on parents and their ability to pay for childcare. So we went out and we asked the question about parents taking the tax credits. And I thought it was interesting that 42% said they have, but the question, the the response that was most interesting to me was that almost a quarter of parents were not even aware that they could take this tax credit. And I think we have a lot to do in terms of education. The provisions that changed in the recent legislation that this would be refundable to low-income families would really make a big difference if we could get those things extended. So just putting a plug in that we would love to see the CDC extended. CDC-TC, sorry about that. Okay, then the final, I think the big question that we were asking on this one was, where are parents? Because we've been trying to think through what's the balance between good tax policy and direct spend and subsidies for parents, and what are parent preference. This one was a little bit of a surprise to me, see this so clearly split evenly between a tax refund and some type of subsidy and refund. I think that was interesting. More to learn on this issue, but I think it gets to the area we've spent some time talking about, which is that we need more than a single solution to the problem confronting parents and affordability of care. So the final thing, if we keep going here, that we wanted to look at, we've done this consistently over time, was childcare closures. And we've been looking at these to see what, from parents' perspective, is going on. This has been pretty consistent, right at about 10% of programs still closed. And we'll continue to track this. The number slightly higher in terms of plans closed with plans to reopen versus the absolute closed. A little bit more ambiguity, I think, in that 15% number than we've seen. Okay, moving right along here. The next thing that we wanted looking forward, keep going to the next slide. We wanted to think about, because there's a conversation going on right now across the country about childcare and pre-K, and what are we going to do as we move forward with any initiative that looks at pre-K for the 3s and 4s. So we wanted to look at what parents thought about this. So next slide, please. So we asked the question, and most of the parents who basically, if we asked if childcare were free for a family, backing up here to the childcare, say they would prefer the arrangement they currently have. And I think that says something too, and we're going to talk about this here soon, as to if it's free and they still would prefer to stay where they are, which is, a lot with, currently using a relative or parent care, then there's something to be thought through in terms of what is the real need to expand childcare in certain locations. And we're going to have a conversation about that. So you can look at those numbers. I think the plurality of parents saying 30% saying they would prefer the arrangement they currently have. In my head, and Claire, you can correct me later on when we get into this part of the conversation, that means 70% said the other. So I think that there's a lot that would keep what they're doing. There's also a significant number that would change if it were free. So let's go to the next slide now, as in terms of the public pre-K as a childcare option. 3/4, and this gets to this issue of whether or not any pre-K expansion should be co-located with childcare. In other words, community-based option. And clearly 71% of parents who responded to this survey said that it would be a better option for them if it were co-located in childcare. And so I think that this gets to a lot of things that we need to be thinking about as legislation gets proposed and enacted, if you will, in the coming months here in Washington. Okay, then next slide. We're almost there, folks, and then we're going to have this conversation, I'm promising. Support for working parents. A strong majority of parents agree with the statement that working parents deserve high-quality childcare. 92%. I don't think you can get much higher than that. I thought that was a phenomenal number. And that expanding government support would be beneficial to parents and children, 88%. Now, I was going to say, you can go online and look at this by income category, in the results that we have posted by even by political party, et cetera. So if you're interested, but those are extremely high numbers of people or parents across this country who really think that this is something that we need to be doing. So with that, I'm going to go through, I'll just show you that we have the respondent demographics in this slide deck so you can take a look at them. I'm not going to necessarily read this. Yes, there's the first one, and then the next one in terms of the job classifications and sort of who responded to the survey so that you can have that information. But I don't want to spend a lot of time talking and reading, so that we can now get on to the conversation. So in the next thing we really do want to do is have this conversation about how do changing work arrangements impact childcare. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, or our discussants, if you will, and very much appreciate them taking the time to be with us this afternoon, and very interested in hearing their thoughts on this. So first, let me introduce Caitlin Molina, who is the Deputy Director of the Rhode Island Department of Human Services. Can you wave? There she is. Claire Taylor, who is the Director of Client Services at Morning Consult. Claire. And then Anubhav Bagley, who is an independent contractor with Arth Analytics in Phoenix, Arizona, and who has been doing the gap analysis for us and has just completed the 35th state, right, Anubhav, I think? So we have 35 states gap in childcare the gap between the supply and the demand for care. So I want to welcome these guys to this because I think they all have a different perspective on this, and they all know the data from a pretty in depth at this point, I would say. So I'm going to start first with Caitlin, and I want to set the stage for this, Caitlin, because you've been weathering the storm through COVID over the last year and all that's happened, and the challenges of trying now to think about how do we build back and what is it going to look like? What's work going to look like? You've looked at the data that we had, seen the briefings, seen the bigger slides. What stands out to you that you think needs to be considered when we start planning for the future of childcare from your perspective at a state level?
Thanks, Linda. And I also just want to, the group here on this thread and on this panel has been truly an inspiration to my own growth professionally and personally. I think Linda reaches out periodically to troubleshoot policy-related items for childcare. And I just feel so privileged to be among a panel that cares so deeply about these issues and talks not just formally, but informally about ways that we can solve for these issues long term. Linda is correct. I am a state administrator, and I was uniquely responsible for reopening Rhode Island's childcare system back in June of 2020. I also offer a unique perspective that I was responsible for reopening a system that I was also a consumer for. I have two small children that attend childcare full time. And so decisions that were made at a state level about reopening Rhode Island's childcare system were also very deeply personal to me because I knew I would be ultimately sending my children there. And so I made decisions in accordance with CDC guidance and our governor's directive, but also wanted to understand the impact that would have for families. I didn't want families to have shame in sending their kids to childcare during a pandemic. And I also wanted families and employers to understand the benefits beyond just workforce support for families who needed that access to high quality childcare. When I look through the data, and I've been pestering folks for years to do this type of analysis to really understand, parent access, utilization, and demand, I think of a few things. I first think about our responsibility as a state to respond to these findings and to think supportively about how we can access additional resources to incentivize and strategically inform childcare programs to work collaboratively across sectors to build out service delivery models that respond to these emerging needs. I have seen childcare do this in response to the pandemic, particularly in building relationships with public schools. I know that they have the capacity and the expertise to do this with employers, but as a state, we need to support that coordination and facilitate those conversations, because this will be a partnership. We need to think about both supporting childcare programs and employers to thinking collaboratively about how to meet the workforce's needs. We also have a responsibility to look at the workforce that is employed at these childcare sites. And so a lot of these workers, when we think about adding hours or modifying the service delivery model, we are asking very low wage workers to accommodate these emerging needs with very little resource and very little support. And so when we think about building better and building brighter, we need to think about the direct supports to our workforce and being able to invest strategically, not just in higher wages, but in professional development, advanced coursework, and other network supports to make sure that staff are able to meet the emerging needs of families. The last thing that I would just add is that, in reopening childcare and thinking about it from a state perspective, um, prior to the pandemic, Rhode Island had done a lot of work with childcare programs to try and think flexibly about how to expand services to respond to these emerging needs. But also, we had a very urgent call to action, which was to increase access and availability to high quality care for young children in Rhode Island. And a lot of our programs, rightfully so, said that they didn't have the resources, they didn't have the facilities, or they didn't have the staff to meet those needs. In the midst of a global pandemic, childcare put aside those concerns and rose and developed great resiliency to being able to meet those emerging needs. In Rhode Island, we saw hundreds of programs identify alternative space to offer school age care to children who were not being served in person in school buildings. We saw programs through cohort models reintroduce families who had been without care for months on end and do so responsibly and safely to support working families. I have incredible confidence in our childcare programs to be able to meet the emerging needs of families and to build those relationships with employers. I need us to think strategically and long term about investing in those services because it requires a really holistic and comprehensive approach. I think that there is innovation that has been developed during the pandemic that we cannot lose. There has been a willingness to think differently about services in a way that programs and families have never even considered. And I want us to continue to have these conversations with the lens of not just being a state administrator or being a policy advocate, but also being a consumer. Many of the individuals, particularly in Rhode Island, that worked to reopen childcare were also working mothers. And so the urgency or the need to develop a system that could respond to these needs was deeply personal. And I think that's what made the state's response so effective. And so those are just a few of the things that I took away. And, I also look at the slides, particularly about a family, not wanting to accept an alternative placement for their child in a high quality pre-K classroom because of that is very real. And I think about that from a parent perspective, but also a state administrator perspective. Children, oftentimes with working families, start childcare at birth at 6 weeks of age, 6 weeks of age. And so if we don't invest in those services starting at birth to develop high quality infant toddler care, for me, it's not just about infusing resources into a community-based organization to enhance the quality of their pre-K classroom. It's really thinking long-term about the continuum of care of services and starting at infancy, because parents build those trusted relationships from the onset of their relationship and engagement with childcare. And we need to be able to leverage that trust in order to build the continuum of care that is needed to support working families.
Wow, thank you. Very, very thoughtful. And I think that you're right. And I think we were talking earlier, Caitlin, about the sort of the need for this, not just a birth to five, but a birth and beyond, because so many of the childcare struggles of families were because schools were closed and they didn't have school age care either. And I think those things all came together in the last year to challenge a lot of this country. Claire, I want to turn to you now and just ask you, you've been working on this now for quite some time with us in these surveys, and you've spent a lot of time looking at some of the questions we've asked around need and preferences in particular. Wanted to get your thoughts on what's been consistent over time, what, especially through the pandemic, what's changed because of the pandemic maybe, and what do you see variations on this? We pointed out some in terms of the urban issues around some of the struggles. Did you see any variations regionally or within demographic groups that stood out for you?
Yeah, that's a great question, Linda. Like you said, we've done 5 surveys together, so we have a large amount of data to look through as we think about what has stayed the same and what has changed. Starting with what has stayed the same, our backdrop to the survey data prior to the pandemic comes from October of 2019 when we fielded our first survey together. And in that survey, we asked in an open-ended format, what are the most important factors as parents think about childcare? And the parents, in their own words, said safety, cleanliness, prevention of illness. So before there was a global pandemic, that was something already top of mind to parents. And we've only seen that continue through. In our survey in December of 2020, in a closed-ended format, we saw that safety, cleanliness, prevention of illness being 3 times more important than any of the other tested variables as parents think about their choosing a childcare provider. So although the intensity of that importance is going to continue and probably remain, it's always been here. In addition, another preference we've seen stay consistent is the preference for a childcare center as their ideal childcare arrangement. We've asked that question in a variety of formats, and we saw that among parents paying for childcare back in our survey in December, that childcare centers were their most ideal childcare arrangement. And in this most recent survey, we found that a plurality, 30% say that if childcare were free to their family, they would most prefer a childcare center. But thinking about what has changed, an interesting measure to look at is parents who are using parent-provided care to provide care for their children. In August of 2020, we found that 13% of parents who were using a formal childcare arrangement were alternating work hours with someone in their household to be able to provide care for their child. In this most recent survey, we found that percentage rose to 23% to provide care during traditional work hours, 38% to provide care during non-traditional work hours. And that percentage is even higher among urban parents as we think about the demographic differences. And I think that's important as we look at this data, is to consider how this is different across different types of communities. And so for urban parents, we found 34% were using parent-provided care during traditional work hours, 44% during non-traditional work hours, and that's nearly double compared to suburban and rural parents. And so with this trend that we're seeing similar to our December data, I think it's an interesting trend that parents are relying on this type of care. And as we move out of the pandemic and back into different work arrangements, I think keeping a pulse on those preferences and the type of care parents are using is going to be really important to understand childcare needs.
Mm-hmm. It is interesting, and I think moving to the next question to Anubhav, because Anubhav started these questions to begin with when he asked the question about we were setting up the mapping, how we were going to do that, and the question about how far will parents drive and how far or do they want it closer to home or closer to work. So you started all this, Anubhav, just so what you know, we can all point the finger at you. So in your opinion, are we closer now to understanding parent preference, parent choice, and understanding that how that will impact what we call the gap between what we have and what we need for childcare in this country? Do you think we've made progress on that? Your thoughts?
Thanks for that question, Linda, and thanks for putting it all on my shoulders. But no, it really was you were the one, and BPC were the ones who were really starting to push this across the country. So yes, I definitely think we have learned a lot with these surveys, because as we started doing the gap analysis, we were looking at that potential need, which we defined a potential need as children with parents, both the parents or single parent in the labor force. And the question was, what is that preference? How many of them prefer to take care of the children by themselves versus with family and friends? So the biggest piece we learned, yes, was friends is not a big percentage. Relatives and family are a definitely large percent. But what was surprising in this to me was also we were seeing in the past surveys, and this one was between 18 to 20% of parents, along with their spouse/partner, prefer taking care of the children. This is higher by about 8 to 10% for children which are younger than 1 year. 1 year and younger is definitely much higher, definitely expected. What was very interesting to me was when I started looking at this survey and seeing how does this preference change if you're able to provide childcare for free or provide childcare for $100 per month and you're highly subsidized. And that 18 to 20% shifts down, but not drastically. It goes to about 15 to 18%. What does shift? There is a shift, and that shift happens from relatives and friends to childcare centers. And that's definitely very telling that there is a preference to move towards centers, but not in that. So I would say that our demand is definitely between 15 to 20% lower than the potential need. Now, this would be very different across the country by different socio-demographic areas, by different cultural preferences. I would expect that to be quite a bit different. But this definitely was very helpful in understanding that to see, okay, there is a 31% gap that we were coming up across the 35 states that we've done to date. But that is now assuming that we had about 15 to 20% over on the potential need that we were thinking of.
So you think we're getting closer, in a nutshell? And
Definitely.
I think, and I do think it is really important to understand the geographics of this. I think we still have a lot to learn, as we've talked about, especially with this group, about rural America and what's going on out there in rural America. And we appreciate anybody's thoughts that's listening to this on that issue. I want to turn now to Caitlin, you first, and then Anubhav. In this survey, we looked at the changing nature of work and the future child care. When it comes to looking at parents and sort of this whole issue, did anything stand out to you in terms of that surprised you in a parent's response to the question about their preference for, let's say, remote work or any of the things that we put up there? And if you could, to talk about the classifications, did anything stand out by a category of employment that you looked at?
Yeah, thank you, Linda. I thought it was particularly interesting to look at it by category of worker, and primarily doing so because we have, in Rhode Island, we have intentionally focused on age categories of care and looking at the utilization of families with infant toddlers. How are they leveraging services? How are preschool families leveraging households? We've also always looked strategically at multi-generational households and whether relative and friend and family care is being delivered within the home because there's a multi-generational component or because there's lack of access. And so being able to see those parent preferences, but also mapping those within the work categories was particularly informative and helpful from a state perspective. I would say that nothing surprised me. I think one piece that I would underscore from my experience in Rhode Island that I would like the group here to think about is that oftentimes families, when they're shopping for childcare, particularly in states where there are significant deserts or lack of access, do not have the privilege of asserting preference in designing or supporting care for their kids. And so oftentimes, you will hear advocates talk about a seesaw or kind of this balancing act between quality and access. I think that we need to better inform families of the options and then responsibly deliver supportive services to respond to those options. And so I've consistently seen where families, while they're surveyed about their preferences or their choices, they ultimately don't feel like they have the autonomy to utilize those preferences when they shop for care. And I also think preferences in terms of access and quality do not necessarily reflect the individualized services that are being delivered within a classroom as opposed to an entire program. So that's some work that we've done in Rhode Island. We've heard from families pretty consistently that they are making choices based on the demographics or the composition of a classroom and not necessarily the entire program, which is very different than what feedback we've heard previously. And we've also heard pretty loudly from families that they are really reconsidering the options that are made available to them by their employer. And we've heard from employers that they are really looking to reevaluate their practices because they want to be an employer of choice. And they recognize the importance of having flexibility and options to their staff. The last piece that is somewhat unrelated, but I think is very much connected to this work, is that at DHS, where we administer public benefits to more than 300,000 families across the state of Rhode Island, we constantly every day talk about the cliff effect for low-income working families and accessing benefits. But I also want to raise the need to think about the cliff effect for childcare programs who are now in receipt of a lot of additional federal aid, have been receiving a lot of CCDF payment practices in flexibility and in perpetuity in response to the pandemic. And I want to think about supporting them strategically and responsibly as they prepare for what may be a sunset of those federal funds and how we can use that to advocate for additional federal funds long term. Those additional federal funds may look different in nature. They may be more focused on infrastructure and some of our other more important investments, but cliff effect is not just meaningful for families, it's also meaningful for these small businesses that are supporting our working families. And so I think that's an important perspective to maintain.
Yeah, and I think that we really do need to be thinking carefully about that and how we figure out how and where we transition and what do we need next. And that I think is a part of some of the things around the social emotional development of children issue, which was those were pretty serious responses too. And we're going to have to figure out how we just figure this out so that we don't all of a sudden turn so much of this off on families. What a catastrophe that would be. Claire, I'm really curious about your thinking, especially around the job classification categories and what you saw there, what we learned, what we didn't learn. And we did ask a gig question, which I thought the results were kind of interesting on that, and how much flexibility in terms of the work is playing into parents' decisions. So do you want to just talk a little bit about that, and especially the gig worker issue?
Definitely. So to start with the job classifications, that was a type of demographic analysis that we hadn't done before. In the past, we had tried to combine part-time workers, full-time workers, hourly salary to try to understand the differences of parents with different types of jobs and how their childcare needs differ. And what these job classifications, they give us a much clearer picture of how childcare preferences and needs differ. A percentage that I can't let go of is the fact that 49% of service workers know their work schedule only 2 weeks in advance. Just numbers like that we would have lost. And we see that trend in other demographics, but that just really stands out of information that we would have missed if we wouldn't have really understood those job classifications. And on the gig worker, so just to explain the question, we asked, have you switched to a gig job over the past 12 months due to childcare responsibilities? This could include needing to work different or more flexible hours to provide care for your child. And the result was 24% yes. And looking at those results, it skews to be higher among low-income workers. It rises to 38% among Black parents and 34% among service workers. And this percentage really surprised us. And so we fielded the question among additional sample to confirm the hypothesis that this data raised among parents broadly. And we got a similar percentage. About 0.25% of adults have switched to a gig job over the past 12 months due to childcare responsibilities. And so I think this question really surprised us. The results were higher than we would have guessed. And I think the follow-up question is to why. Why did you feel that you had to switch jobs? Was it because you lost your job? Was it because your childcare provider closed and you need to alternate hours with your spouse or partner? Did your childcare provider close? I think there's a lot of additional information needed to understand that fully. I think the fact that 34% of service workers said yes, higher among any of the other job classifications, helps to answer that. It could have been because they lost their job during the pandemic. And then moving forward, is that type of flexibility preferred with the work that they have? As we think about back to the parent provided care percentage, is that something that they want to be able to continue to have a more flexible type of employment to be able to have parent provided care for their child? So it's one of those data points that just gives us more questions to ask, I think.
Yeah. I think that the people at BPC have known that I've been doing this is keeping my own little personal, every time I have a delivery or something, ask them the question about, why are you doing this? What did you do before? And it's a pretty interesting thing of what is motivating people to take on some of these gig jobs. And that a lot of people like it. I think that's going to be something we're going to have to think through as we move forward. On above, I think we're getting to the point to where we should take some audience questions. But the one final thing I'd like to ask you, you've now mapped the gap in 35 states, and you see what we have or don't have for data on all of this in terms of understanding the supply, which then supports parent choice and preference. What would you say to people on this call that would help? Caitlin is one of them, but what do we say to states to do a better job with data so we can understand some of these things? What's missing in your thoughts, in your work?
That was such a great question. And as you said, we've been kind of delving into data from all the 35 states for more than a year now. I think the biggest piece is stepping back and looking at the childcare facility data and also any of the analysis that we want as to what is the information we want to glean from all of this, and then start collecting that data based on what we need. At this time, in my opinion, what I'm seeing is a lot of the data on the childcare facility side is collected at the programmatic level rather than at the comprehensive level that starts getting us information on who are the users, what are their needs, what is the supply by time of day, supply by cost, supply by quality. The survey was pretty clear on the fact that the parents are looking for flexibility on quality of care, on the cost of care, and definitely we've answered a lot of those other questions. So I think that would be the biggest piece I would request for the states. If possible, we could start looking at a comprehensive data platform or a way to start building these data systems and also start highlighting some of the best practices we found to date. The other piece I would recommend is looking at the analysis and looking at the survey and looking at the gaps, but also looking at it disaggregated by different socioeconomic areas. The gaps are not similar across the whole country. The gaps are not similar across all socioeconomic demographic profiles. So looking at those by disaggregating them is a big deal to kind of going forward.
Well, we've still got a lot of challenges in front of us. I think that it's safe to say on that front. We do have audience questions. So Mimi, do you want to, give us one or two of them, if you would? Looking at them, let's see. There's a question here. I agree with Caitlin. How do we direct funds and support for shared services models of childcare? How do we get programs to work together? Family childcare, schools, businesses, etc. Do you have any more thoughts on how to incentivize people to really roll up their sleeves and create these partnerships?
Yeah, in Rhode Island, we've started to have those conversations with new unfamiliar partners to the childcare space. And so we've been inviting employers and commerce, partners within our commerce department to think more strategically about incentivizing engagement from employers to partner with childcare operators. A challenge, which I think is easily overcome, but a challenge is typically when we invite an employer to think about building out childcare access for their employees, there's often this desire to do that independent of, a third-party childcare operator coming to support. And I think it's really important when we build out those partnerships to really engage the existing infrastructure, because these providers do have unique skills in offering pretty comprehensive array of services. And so we don't want to recreate or create a new or parallel system. We want to merge what is a healthy and vibrant opportunity to engage more, intuitive opportunities for employees to participate in childcare. We've been doing a lot of work with our CCR&R, which is our childcare resource and referral agency, to think about not just engaging those shared services models, but also incentivizing those partners to participate in them. Some of that is with engagement. In Rhode Island, family childcare is actually organized by a union, SEIU, and so thinking about collaborating with those unions to build out those shared services networks. I think food support, food access, and a lot of those basic needs are really fundamental ways to build out those shared services networks in the beginning, and then you can expand and evolve upon those models over time. I think that there is an immediate instinctually, I think states think that there needs to be a really complex model of shared services. I don't know that that's necessarily accurate. I think that you can start with meeting simple basic needs across a network of programs and then incrementally expand those services over time. I've also been really working on more fully integrating childcare services within our public schools. So we've been partnering with our Department of Ed during COVID. Before and after care, which previously operated in public school buildings, was really devastated. I think public schools were really focused on the typical school day and did not feel like they had the capacity to bring on before and after school care. You can see from the results of this survey that that is incredibly important for families, and they also don't want to have to juggle their kids across placements. And so being able to bring in those childcare services into school buildings, not just employers, is really important for continuity of care. And, to Linda's point around social emotional support, a child should not have to be placed on a bus more than twice a day to receive care during a typical, a 9 to 5 day. And oftentimes that is what is happening in communities because we're not building out those shared service networks. And so I think I don't have all of the answers, but I do I do think there are some emerging opportunities to kind of braid those existing services to think more collaboratively. And I do think that there's also an opportunity for states to leverage their existing networks with out of school time programming and after school networks to also think about how we can bring those partners to the table to respond to these needs.
Mm-hmm. I do think half of the problem is, and I think some of this coming up on this and with this survey is at least understanding what the question is. And I think for a long time, we didn't even think about what is the real question that from parents' perspective. And I think it's one of the things we've been trying to do is get parents' thoughts into this conversation. We have a question in here in terms of the parents needing care between 6 and 8 p.m. That is worrisome, and how many total hours a day are those children away from their parents? I don't think, Claire, in our survey we necessarily saw, and we can look into this, that their children are there for longer hours. It's just that the parents' shifts of work are different. So, and am I wrong on that? I think that if the child was in there from 6 in the morning till 8 at night, that would be one thing. But that's not, I don't think, what we were seeing, was it?
That's correct. We asked among those who indicated that they needed care in non-traditional work hours, when was it that they needed care? And the 49% was those who indicated they needed care from 6 to 8 p.m. And one trend that we did see was that was higher among those who were in the healthcare job classification. So I think that shows they're not, the children are not there for the whole day, but that just when the care is needed differs by the type of job that the parent has.
That's an interesting thought too, because I have a niece who's a nurse and she works long shifts, but fewer of them. So I think you have to be with all of these kinds of things in context. And then there's a question here about the data systems. Is there an effective data info management system that's commercially available? I don't think we could get into that, but we'd certainly like to have that conversation with someone in terms of what would we like to see in a system. And I think to Anubhav's point, I think one of the things that we have found in all the work we've done, Anubhav, you can jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we do not have a clear understanding of how many childcare spaces we have by age of child in this country. And so when we try to think about the need for infant care, 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds, even beyond, we don't know that because our databases don't tell us that. And it's hard to design systems when you don't know what the target population is. And I think that's probably been the biggest struggle. I think, what did we see? Maybe 3 or 4 states that could tell us that, right, Anubhav?
That's correct. That's absolutely correct.
So I think that's a conversation worth having. Whoever asked that question, we'd love to follow up on that. I think it looks like we're just about out of time, and I did want to ask each of the panelists or the discussants to just sort of, based on your knowledge of the data, what 1 or 2 recommendations would you make as we move out of COVID and begin to build a better system of care. What's your takeaway from all this? What are the first two things you think we should start to do here? And I'm going to start with Anubhav, let you off the hook early.
Oh, perfect. I would say two things. One, I think we need to start looking more on rural areas and their needs, because I think that piece, there is a definite lack of information in rural areas. And the other piece is, I think, going forward, as states move forward on this, doing more surveys with more localized, state level or regional kind of input related to something similar would be very helpful to see how things change in the future.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I've been saying. The closer to the ground you get, and the more you need the data, the more you need to understand the local community, and you can't do that from a national survey. So, totally believe that. And just good news, where our next survey is going to be rural, right, Claire? So, Claire, let's go to you. And what all you've learned from that? What do you want to say to us?
I think something that's going to be important to keep a pulse on is understanding parents' need as work preferences and work style continues to evolve. The split on that first question of parents' preferred work arrangement really stood out to me, of really divided across working in person, working in a hybrid model, working remotely, and understanding how that continues to evolve and how businesses can provide solutions. I keep thinking about the percent who are aware of their work schedule, how far in advance they are aware of their work schedule. And is that a helpful solution? If businesses are able to provide a fixed work schedule for their employees, what impact does that make on parents, and how helpful would that be as they think about their childcare needs?
I've often thought in that one, and I know we need to move on, is that if parents could stabilize work and stabilize childcare, their turnover rates in some of these, service industries might go down. I think we need to start to think through the case with business for stabilizing some of these things. And I think it is, as we started out by saying, it's a two-way street. So, Caitlin, we're going to give you the last word here. What are your thoughts, your takeaways from all this?
So I have a lot. I think there are sort of three key strategies that I take away in thinking about how to respond to these findings and how to prioritize response in Rhode Island. The first is around family engagement. So I think when I look at the responses, it's one thing for a family to identify needs. It's another to actually utilize the services once they're made available. So there's incredible shame with accessing off-hour care, right? I experienced that as myself as a working parent. Childcare extends the hours, but then my kid is the last one there for pickup, right? And so what does that mean for families, and how do we build out those relationships so that there's an understanding and an appreciation of needing that level of service, and being able to build out those networks so you don't feel like you're the only parent utilizing the service in which you need. The second is around, I think the data piece is an important one, and it's not often one that we prioritize in state service. For state administrators to be able to respond to emerging needs, we need to have access to self-service data, and we don't. We are continually working on that, but not being able to respond in real time to those emerging needs because we're not able to have access to the data at a time in which we need it is a huge detriment to both program and policy. And so typically when states receive a lot of federal funding, as we should, we immediately release it to programs, to families. But there needs to be a dedicated focus on building out an infrastructure to support ongoing data analysis and support to make concrete and consequential decisions that support increased access and availability of care for families. And then the third one is workforce, both workforce support and workforce enablement. I speak on this particularly as a parent. I know that my children's teachers are underpaid and undervalued. It's the reason why I bring gifts and I thank them and I write them thank you notes every single week, because my children spend more waking hours with their childcare teachers than they do myself or my husband. And I recognize the value and the importance of that. But until we see higher wages and more supports for the workforce, and we begin to value them as the critical and essential workers that they are, educators, I think we're going to really struggle with building out a system to support increased access and availability. And so I'm really looking forward to having more conversations around how to strategically do that without funding or subsidizing a pilot, right? Like there needs to be long-term sustainable funding to think about an infrastructure of employer and workforce support. And that requires much more than this one-time federal stimulus conversation or discussion about childcare.
Mm-hmm. It's really true. We need to close here, but I just want to say, it always mystifies me how you can go. I mean, if you go to the airline industry or hotel industry, and you can get, exactly how many rooms they have open, what size they are, who can be, and we can't figure this out in childcare. We need to, I think this is an area we need to engage business to help us on this, because they would definitely benefit from that. But I'll get off my little platform here and say thank you to each and every one of you. Great conversation. And I really urge the audience to go in and look into the data, dig into the data. And then if you have more questions, feel free to call us. We're more than happy to talk to or link you up with someone who can answer those questions and share your thoughts with us. But the good news is the next survey is on rural America, and we hope to have more information to share with everyone. So in closing, I want to thank all of you one more time. Thank our funder, the Klingenstein Family Foundation, who funded this work with us. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.